What would you do if, after years, you discovered that your child had been swapped at the hospital after birth? This almost became the reality for Mr. and Mrs. Jerry. Years ago, in the bustling city of Lagos, Mrs. Jerry discovered she was pregnant with her first child. It should have been a joyous time, but for her and her husband, it was a season filled with struggle and uncertainty. The Jerrys lived in poverty, barely able to afford food, let alone proper medical care. They relied heavily on faith, trusting that God would see them through. Mrs. Jerry's pregnancy was challenging from the start. She often went without meals, leaving her weak and malnourished. Antenatal visits were out of the question since they couldn't afford the costs. Her husband, Mr. Jerry, was a simple tailor who struggled to find customers to support their basic needs. Despite these difficulties, the couple remained hopeful, holding on to the belief that their child was a blessing waiting to arrive. Things took a turn for the worse when, at 8 months pregnant, Mrs. Jerry fell gravely ill. She became alarmingly pale and weak, showing signs of severe anemia. A local chemist named Cynthia, who had always been kind to the Jerrys, helped as much as she could by providing medications on credit. Cynthia was a lifesaver, often surprising the couple with food items and beverages to help them get by. However, this time, Cynthia's help wasn't enough. Mrs. Jerry's condition worsened, and her survival, and that of her unborn baby, hung in the balance. Mr. Jerry knew his wife needed urgent medical attention, but they had no money. Miraculously, a customer approached Mr. Jerry with an urgent request for an outfit to be sewn. After negotiating, Mr. Jerry was paid up front. Without wasting a second, he rushed his wife to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, Dr. Fabian immediately recognized the severity of Mrs. Jerry's condition. He ordered a blood test, which revealed she had only 16% of the blood volume she needed, far below the safe limit. Both mother and child were in critical danger. Dr. Fabian recommended an immediate blood transfusion, but when Mr. Jerry inquired about the cost, he realized the money he had wasn't nearly enough to cover it. Overwhelmed with worry, Mr. Jerry began pacing the hospital corridors, desperate for a solution. Then, as though fate intervened, he bumped into an old friend, Mr. Kelvin. The two hadn't seen each other in years. "Jerry," Mr. Kelvin exclaimed. "What are you doing here? You look so worried." With tears in his eyes, Mr. Jerry explained his wife's dire condition and their inability to afford the blood she urgently needed. Mr. Kelvin's face lit up. "Today's your lucky day," he said. "I'm in charge of the blood bank here. Come with me and I'll make sure you get everything you need free of charge." Mr. Jerry was overcome with gratitude and followed Mr. Kelvin to the blood bank. With the necessary pints secured, he hurried back to Dr. Fabian, who quickly began the transfusion. Mrs. Jerry's condition stabilized over the following days. She spent a week in the hospital, during which time her pregnancy reached 36 weeks. To everyone's relief, she gave birth to a healthy, bouncing baby girl. But just when the Jerrys thought their troubles were over, something unsettling happened. That same day, a wealthy woman named Miss Joy visited the hospital. Miss Joy was a single, affluent woman who had long desired a child but had none of her own. Her wealth afforded her anything she wanted, and now she had come to adopt a baby. She met with Dr. Fabian in his office, where they discussed the adoption process. After finalizing the paperwork, Dr. Fabian escorted Miss Joy to the baby's ward. The ward was divided into two sections, one for motherless babies available for adoption and the other for babies whose mothers were temporarily recovering in a different part of the hospital. While browsing the ward, Miss Joy's attention was drawn to Mrs. Jerry's baby girl, who was especially beautiful and serene. "This is the one I want," Miss Joy declared, pointing to the infant. Dr. Fabian hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this baby's mother is here at the hospital. She's not available for adoption." Miss Joy, however, was not used to being told no. She offered Dr. Fabian a substantial bribe, promising him more money than he could refuse. Succumbing to greed, Dr. Fabian agreed to her request. Together, they hatched a plan to swap Mrs. Jerry's baby with one from the motherless section. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was overheard by a nurse named Mrs. Veronica. Standing just outside the door, Mrs. Veronica couldn't believe her ears. She knew she had to act fast. Without delay, she rushed to Mrs. Jerry's ward and explained everything. "Go to the children's ward right now," Mrs. Veronica urged. "Pick up your baby and start breastfeeding her. When the doctor comes in with the woman, they'll try to make you leave. No matter what they say, don't let them take your baby." Shocked but determined, Mrs. Jerry followed the nurse's instructions. She hurried to the children's ward, cradled her baby, and began nursing her. Moments later, Dr. Fabian and Miss Joy arrived, only to find Mrs. Jerry already with her child. "Mrs. Jerry," Dr. Fabian said smoothly, "you're not supposed to be here right now. Why don't you return to your ward and rest?" Mrs. Jerry looked him squarely in the eye. "I'm feeding my baby, doctor. I'm not leaving her side." The doctor tried every tactic he could think of, but Mrs. Jerry wouldn't budge. Frustrated and unable to proceed with their plan, Dr. Fabian and Miss Joy were forced to abandon their scheme. Furious, Miss Joy stormed out of the hospital, refusing to adopt any other child. Thanks to Nurse Veronica's bravery, Mrs. Jerry's baby was saved from being taken away. The Jerrys returned home, grateful not only for their daughter's life but also for the stranger who had stood up for them in their darkest hour. Lovelies, what is your opinion regarding to this true life story? Leave your comments on the comments section.